And we can start. We have our speaker, Dr. Natalie Graham, and I'd like to introduce her. So, and Dr. Graham is a native of Gainesville, Florida, and she earned her master's in creative writing at the University of Florida and completed her PhD in American Studies at Michigan State University as a University Distinguished Fellow. Her poems have appeared in Kalalu, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, New England, the New England Review, Valley Voices, a literary review, and Southern Humanities. And her articles have appeared in the Journal of Popular Culture and Transition. She is a Cave Canem Fellow and an Associate Professor of African American Studies at Cal State University, Fullerton. Dr. Graham's specialty, I'll continue with the introduction. Her specialty includes Black popular music, Black masculinity and identity performance, and Black poetics. Dr. Graham has also been generous to share her time share her poetry during one of our Poetry for Pleasure classes in the past. So please welcome Dr. Natalie Graham.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Oh, it's yes. Do you typically have the videos off? Is that, you're for the programming? Okay. So yeah, again, thank you for the invitation. OLLI has definitely been an organization that I've been working with and partnering with since coming here about 8 years ago. We've done lots of poetry, both the workshop and other works together, collaborating with poetry with OLLI. So it's always nice to be back here with this organization. And so I was just invited to chat a little bit about the new institute that just been created in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. We were official as of October of 2020, so we're brand new. But I wanted to share a little bit about the background for the organization, a little bit about some of the projects that we're doing, and maybe just invite any questions that you have. Please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat. I don't know, or I think you can maybe raise your hand and your digital hand and unmute yourselves, and then we can have a conversation. I would love to hear your feedback and the things that you're interested in knowing more about as we're having this time together. And so I'll start by sharing my screen. I have a couple of PowerPoint slides, and I'll just kind of go through some of the foundational concepts of IBII. So IBII, as you know, is the Institute of Black Intellectual Innovation at Cal State Fullerton. And when I think about this organization and I think about talking about it, and as we're developing and building what are the core pillars of the work that we're doing, really the number one core concept is partnership. We're deeply invested and interested in partnership and engagement and innovation. But I would say the number one sort of core ideal is this sort of integrated partnership. And so what does it mean? We talk a lot about, there's a lot of buzzwords, you hear diversity a lot, but then you also hear some, a lot of times it feels like there's the same recurring issues with diversity or with racism or anti-racism in our communities. So when I think of diversity and inclusion, right? So these are some of the words that I think about when I think about what diversity and inclusion means or can mean when it's a meaningful effort. It's a meaningful, thoughtful effort. Some of those words are possibility, innovation, boldness, options, future, imagination, and creativity. And I invite you to, like, as you're thinking about, we're talking and kind of working through this idea of what does diversity mean or what does inclusion mean, I invite you to put some of those things in the chat. Like, what does diversity mean to you? What does inclusion mean to you? Another word that I think is a key concept that we often don't think about is bravery. Like, how can we bravely attend to issues that might make us feel uncomfortable or might kind of challenge us to change, right? So we're always thinking about how can we challenge ourselves, challenge each other to change and grow. So, diversity, inclusion, how can we make it meaningful? How can we revise concepts that kind of maybe have lost some of their power? And so that brings me to this idea, again, foundational concepts of the Institute is really thinking about anti-racist and anti-bias, right? We have anti-racist, some, three tenets of much of the anti-racism and anti-bias research that's out there is that, one, race blind or race neutral policies are not really effective for dismantling these systemic racial inequities. And so that's a mouthful. There's lots of different like terminology in that bullet point. But the core idea is that throughout the 80s and the 90s and even the early 2000s, there was a lot of um, energy behind this idea of race neutrality. We wanted to think about equality as happening as long as we were just blind to race. We didn't see race. We just moved forward in this idea of sort of like this, this rainbow where everyone is the same and we don't really consider anyone's individuality. We're kind of race neutral or race blind. And so what we found, in the last, 10 to 20 years is that those policies are increasingly ineffective, right? And so the last, I would say, 20 years of research around, dismantling racism, dismantling inequity has turned back toward this idea of being what's race, the new term you hear is race positive or race conscious. So moving away from the kind of fear people have around race, we don't want to say Black, we don't want to say, we don't know if we should say Black or African American, or we don't want to, make any comment about someone's race or pretend like that has nothing to do with the situation. There's a move toward race and saying and an acknowledgement that says that race does still matter in the US. How any individual looks or their cultural background, the way that they speak, all of those things are embedded in race concepts and these old, often subconscious concepts of good, bad, smart, uneducated. All of these concepts are tied up in race and concepts of race. So moving away from, and so that's one of the reasons why we wanted to think about specifically having a center on campus that institutionalizes the idea of Black folks or Black people on campus, students, staff, faculty, as being embedded in the institution of Cal State Fullerton. And we wanted to have a race conscious institute that's saying, like, yes, this doesn't, exclude anyone else, but it focuses on Black students, staff, and faculty, or mainly students and faculty on campus at Cal State Fullerton, and also the community, right, turning towards Orange County. And so the second point is that bias is unconscious and it's ordinary and it's invisible because we justify it or it's kind of underneath our ability to sort of notice it. So I said that a bit in the first point, that this idea that often these policies or these ways of being seem very natural, they seem very embedded in, particular going about our everyday lives, but there's still an element of bias inside of the actions that happen. And also these biases or these individual actions accumulate over time. And so the last point is about what's typically called microaggressions. And so microaggressions are an example of commonly held beliefs or biases that are tied to race, that often disadvantage people of color. And so here we're talking about Black people. So a microaggression might be someone saying that um, you speak really well for a Black person, like you're so articulate, right? And so on the face of it, it sounds like a compliment, right? You're saying like, oh, like you're articulate, you're educated. But really underlying that, that compliment is the microaggression that's rooted in a concept that says that African Americans are commonly inarticulate, right? There's this underlying racial bias. And so those are kind of the three tenets or three concepts that have come out of recent anti-racist and anti-bias research that the Institute tries to, through programming, projects, research, address more like directly. And so I've made mention of throughout this, so far I've made mention of the word bias quite a bit. And that's something that when we talk about, anti-Black bias, or we talk about anti-Black racism, bias is really a core concept that you hear people talking about often. And there's a great book about it. If you haven't been introduced to this book, there's a great book called Biased that really kind of outlines, and I'm going to show this video, but I'll also put the information in the chat, so you can kind of find out more about the book as the video is going. It's about 4 minutes. And so this book, she outlines this concept of bias, right? And the way that we think about bias, and kind of she goes through and gives an example of how bias can be both, troubling and devastating, but also sort of common and unconscious, and how this idea of bias really does impact all of us.
Jennifer Eberhardt, and I'm the author of Biased: Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice that Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. In my career as a social psychologist and professor of psychology at Stanford University, I've dedicated myself to researching and teaching about implicit bias, what it is, where it comes from, how it affects us, and how we can address it. Implicit bias is not a new way of calling someone a racist. In fact, you don't have to be a racist at all to be influenced by it. As I'll explain in depth later, implicit bias is a kind of distorting lens that's a product of both the architecture of our brains and the disparities in our society. Our ideas about race are shaped by the stereotypes to which we are exposed on a daily basis. And one of the strongest stereotypes in American society associates Blacks with criminality. Here's where I would normally break out the graphs and slides, but instead, I'm going to tell you a personal story. A few years ago, I took my son Everett on a plane. He was 5 years old, wide-eyed and trying to take it all in. So he's looking around on the plane, and he saw a Black passenger and then said, "Hey, that guy looks like Daddy." Now I look at the man, and he doesn't look anything at all like Daddy. He looks nothing like his father. I couldn't help but be struck by the irony. The race researcher having to explain to her own Black child that not all Black people look alike. Just as I was about to begin lecturing my son, he looked up at me and he says, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane." "Why would you say that?" I asked, as gently as I could, though I was on the brink of being upset. "You know Daddy wouldn't rob a plane." Yes, I know." "Well, why would you say that?" Everett looked up at me with a sad face. He says, "I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I was thinking that. Even with no malice, this Black crime association made its way into the mind of my 5-year-old child. just as it has made its way into all of us. I wrote this book to show the many surprising places and ways that implicit bias affects all sorts of decisions we make during the normal course of our lives. The homes we buy, the people we hire, the way we treat our neighbors. People can hold biases based on all sorts of characteristics: skin color, age, weight, ethnic origin, accent, disability, height, gender. But neither our evolutionary path nor our present culture dooms us to be held hostage by these biases. Change requires a kind of open-minded attention that is well within our reach. There are successful approaches we can learn from and new ways of thinking we can build upon. In this series of videos,
And so I'm just going to stop there, because that's really the key for the work that we're trying to do with the Institute of Black Intellectual Innovation, is to think about how do we work towards dismantling anti-Black bias? Like, how can we professionally and personally, give what she calls here open-minded attention. We talk a lot in the Institute, and as we're working through the programming, about really being intentional in our dismantling of anti-Black bias and our dismantling of creating worlds and creating new futures that don't rely on those age-worn stereotypes, and that also aren't sort of a reactive response to any individual, racist, overt action that's happening in society. So I think that we're just gonna move forward. We don't really have, since we don't have the videos and discussion. This is a sort of question that I would ask all of you. I would say, well, for you, personally and professionally, what does it mean to give us open-minded attention to dismantling anti-Black bias? With the assumption that bias is, culturally and widely held. It's not something that, as she says in the video, that it's not this new way of calling someone racist, or it's not a new way of saying that someone is sort of bad, right? I think in a lot of circles, being called racist is like the worst thing you can be called, right? But I think it's important for folks to recognize that you can hold bias, and it can be sort of deeply rooted and without malice, right? And beginning there allows us to do the work of dismantling it, not just in our, she talks a lot about, and this book talks a lot about the psychology and the way that bias often is tied to this desire to protect ourselves and our family. It doesn't mean that it's not, pernicious and awful, but it does come from some of the, the ways that our brain responds to certain stimuli and trauma. And so so that's sort of like the groundwork, like why we're doing what we're doing, what are some of the issues that we face. And out of that, we created the Institute of Black Intellectual Innovation. And this is a quote that I've read this quote several times, and some of you, as was stated earlier, I'm a poet. So a lot of the ways I approach this sort of work is from a creative lens and integrating creativity with other forms of research activity and other forms of programming. This quote from Langston Hughes really is sort of in the framework of IBII. It comes from a longer poem called I Too, and the quote is, "Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America." In the same way that Langston Hughes, 100 years ago, and then, 100 years before him, Frederick Douglass, really appealed to the American ideal and appealed to folks to recognize Black people as embedded in the institution of the US. The Institute of Intellectual Innovation, the Institute of Black Intellectual Innovation, is appealing to Cal State Fullerton and the community of Orange County to consider Black people as embedded in part of what it means to be a Titan, what it means to be a resident of Orange County, and also acknowledging that we're not there yet, right? And acknowledging that many Black people don't feel comfortable on campus. They don't feel comfortable in their classrooms. They don't feel comfortable in Orange County. And a lot of it has to do with being such, the way that, many of you know, we have about 2.5% Black students on campus. Orange County also reflects similarly that percentage, those demographics. There's about 3% African Americans in Orange County. And it's not just the percentage, it's the legacy. There is a long and discouraging racial history of Orange County as it particularly relates to Black people, as not being welcome and being pushed out of Orange County. So part of what we're doing is thinking about how can we revise that legacy? How can we, take partners? And so I'll talk a little bit about some of those aspirations, assumptions, and approaches. One, there's an assumption that we have a responsibility as artistic and intellectual leaders, both on campus and off campus, to shape the legacy of our campus and region. We want folks to see Cal State Fullerton and Orange County as a place, as a simple aspiration states, where Black people thrive, instead of as a place where Black people can endure, or where we're working to dismantle some of these achievement gaps, or working to minimize some of these issues. We want to instead aim to make Cal State Fullerton a place where Black people thrive, Orange County a place where Black people thrive. And our approach has been through innovation, doing things in a different way, starting with these very large, ambitious goals in mind, and doing that through interdisciplinary collaboration and collaboration with off-campus partners. The what of IBII, the mission, simply stated, is, as I mentioned before, to think about how can we institutionalize support and inclusion of Black people, culture, creative arts, and intellectual history at Cal State Fullerton and throughout Orange County, right? How can that be part of the legacy of the university, the legacy of the county, and really just part of what we do, right? So people kind of know us for doing that on campus. We don't have to go out and have Super Sundays and go to Black churches and tell people, to send their children here, because they'll know that Cal State Fullerton is a place where their children will thrive. How are we planning to do that? We're planning to do that by using innovative, and again, you see, innovative in triplicate, innovative research and arts development, innovative teaching support, and innovative service models. And I'll just speak briefly about one of those projects, the project that we're doing right now, and how that integrates these three goals of the work of IBII. So this semester, we reached out to UACRE, which is a program on campus. UACRE has, in the Arboretum, you may know this, there is a learning farm, right? And so they do a lot of work with learning about how to grow, there's students out there kind of measuring soil, measuring like how to make plants more nutritious, how to have more yield from the crops. So there's this learning farm right on campus at Cal State Fullerton. And UACRE has used that learning farm to partner with Monkey Business Cafe, which is a restaurant in Fullerton. And so, Monkey Business Cafe works with foster youth in the area and helps them transition from the position of being foster youth to actually being engaged and giving them, ways, a place to work, place to get, job training. So there's already this, partnership on campus and off campus. And so I approached UACRE, and Sarah Johnson, who works there, works with UACRE, she's another faculty member in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, to create a model where we could have a student creative research fellow. our student creative research fellow is going to work with, if we were on campus, she would go to the farm, but right now she'll just be working with the different food and crops off campus. And so she's going to work to think about the different recipes and ingredients and agricultural techniques that Africans made when they were first brought to the US during the slave era, and think about the transition of African American food culture and how it relates to the sort of farming traditions and the food that is created right now. So she's going to do a little research. What are some of the African American food, what's some of the African American food culture historically and up until now? If we had to think about, you know, African American food culture in Southern California, what does that look like? And then she's going to create a cookbook that integrates this historical knowledge and revised, sort of modernized recipes, thinking about the food that they're growing in the farm, and then also working with the chef at Monkey Business Cafe to create recipes that integrate and modernize these African American cultural histories and context. So in that project, we have sort of partnership across different disciplines. Like, it's really important to partner with outside of the department. That's something that's deeply important to the work that I want to do on campus. We're working in a very sort of mentorship model with upper division undergrad students. So undergraduate research is a key component of all of the work we're doing. We're working with off-campus partners, businesses, technology leaders, poets, different people off campus to bridge that gap between students and the work that they do on campus and sort of the public, getting that internship experience, getting that experience, connecting with partners off campus. So that's another key component, off-campus partnerships. And then really thinking differently about having final work that, granted, we are going to talk a lot about research. Like, as I work with our, you know, creative research student fellow, we're going to talk about research. We're going to talk about like what sort of journals we're looking at. There's a great journal called, it's in the UC system. It's called Gastronomica. I can look it up, but it's like a journal of food culture. And so we'll look at what does it mean? What is contemporary research? How do you write an article for an academic journal? But our final project is going to be the cookbook. It's going to be a public-facing, public humanities creation that then can go out and sort of both instruct and create community and conversation in and around the campus, in and around Orange County. So that's one project that we're working on. There's lots of different ideas that we have, but obviously we just got started. So there are lots of different things that we are trying to do, that we are working on. And so that's just an example. If you have questions, again, I think we can always, you know, raise hands or put questions in the chat. And then I just have a couple of other things. If you're interested in supporting the mission, if you're interested in what we're doing, we primarily right now do a lot of the conversation through the African American Studies page on Facebook. So if you follow the page, if you engage with the page, you'll find out about all the work that we're doing with IBII. Every first Saturday, we're committed to having what we call Black Book Chat, which takes a book. And there are a lot of these different books on we noticed that there's, after, you know, last summer and the uprisings, there are all of these book lists that were being circulated that were saying, okay, here's the next best anti-racist reading list. Here's how you can instruct yourself about, or learn more about race, right? There are all these lists coming out, but they seemed overwhelming. We weren't sure if people were really able to engage with this, to be able to do the reading. So created Black Book Chat, where every first Saturday at 10 a.m., from 10 a.m. to 11:30, we're committed to discussing one of the books on these, reading lists, right? And so Bias, the book that I mentioned, was one of our books that we read. February 6th, we'll have another book, and I just wanted to, I'll put the description of the book in the chat. Again, so if you're interested in Black Book Chat, February 6th, we'll be reading this great book called The Sovereignty of Quiet. And the sovereignty of quiet is, and there's kind of a description of what it is, but it thinks about, African-American culture in a different way. So that's, again, going back to this idea of being innovative and thinking in a, representing and creating space for conversation around, Black intellectual innovation. We wanted also to create opportunities to think differently about what Black culture means in 2020, 2021. And so this book talks about like expressiveness and as characterized as like internal instead of, expressive, dramatic, and defiant, right? Those are key ways that African-American culture, African-American people are often described. And so this book looks differently about, the internal life, right? And the inner life. And so we'll be talking about that February 6th. The Black Book Chats are open to all community members. We also always state in our advertising that you do not have to have read the book to join in on Black Book Chat. You can just come in, listen, share, have conversations. At the end of every session, we always give suggestions for how to get involved in the community. So it's really kind of public humanities, public facing, community facing, and trying to help people get involved and connected and have these conversations that are difficult to have. So that's February 6th. The other way you can support this mission is by partnering with us. Like I mentioned, we're working with Monkey Business Cafe. We're working with UACRE on campus. We really want to have a whole sort of class of these creative research fellows, right? So my next goal with IBII is to have creative research faculty fellows where we can help untenured faculty, become tenured and stay on campus. One of the issues with diversity is that often faculty who are hired don't stay. And so finding a way to both hire and keep great, faculty is really important. So that's another, sort of mission that we're doing. We also want to do a creative technology fellow. We want to think about, a creative health and wellness fellow. So we're doing like kind of branching out and having different student fellows and faculty fellows so that we can connect all across campus to do different programs and projects as we grow. If you want to join the Black Book Chat, the best way to join is to, there's always going to be an event on the Facebook page. And so that will give you the Zoom link for the Black Book Chat. So through the Facebook page, that's where we're keeping kind of communications, and we'll also start to do a little bit more programming and information about that. So any other questions? Oh, the other thing, of course, is if you want to support us through giving, we do welcome any sort of donations or support through the, the campaign of giving. We really do want to expand, and it's also something that we're community driven. Like we are supported by philanthropic donations entirely. So we really do encourage you to share, but most important, and I put it number one because following us and engaging with us, having these conversations, when we, come back in person, creating roundtables and conversations together is the number one thing that we're interested in: partnership and community. So really do encourage you to think about any, questions, comments. You feel free to email me or reach out to me. The next thing we have is Innovative Arts Futures Conference. One of the things that IBII is doing is twice a year we have all-day conferences. December 3rd, we had a conference from 11 a.m. until about 7:30 p.m. And we had 20 panelists, we had over 300 attendees, we had students, sharing about the work, about the sort of engagement with different books. And then we had the authors of those books come and read from the books and kind of respond to the student performances. We had filmmakers, we had poets, we had a wide range, we had, lawyers, a wide range of panelists to talk about, these core issues and how can we create a different future, imagine a different world. So much of the work that we're doing is really trying to imagine something different, to create something different, because we kind of can get stuck in the present, we get stuck in like difficult things that we see. I didn't want, we didn't want to create an organization that's responding to every terrible thing we see on TV. We wanted to create an institute that's looking forward, that's imagining a different future and working toward that different future consistently, so that we can build something, right? We're really interested in building something. Thank you, Catherine, for that suggestion. I'll absolutely look that up.
Firstly, I'd like to say that I can't think of a better way that we could have opened this brand new series, OLLI series of our diversity eclectics. I mean, this was an amazing presentation to hear about this brand new organization that we have here on campus, and so much food for thought that I can't thank you enough. So with that, do we have any other comments or questions for Natalie? Okay. I also had a thought about well, I had many thoughts, but especially the video regarding the book, and forgive me, I can't recall the diversity, I think it was, and the thought that you need to be aware of your thoughts, and that's where it begins, I think, is awareness, because most of us aren't even aware of these hidden unconscious thoughts that we have every day. And once we become aware of that pattern, then we have an opportunity to change the way we think.
Right.
So for my case, I know that's how I've begun to think about it, is to really attempt to be aware of what I'm thinking.
Right. Yeah, I think that it's absolutely true. Like it's the awareness, and then of there's a certain, I mean, we talk a lot about empathy. Like, what does it mean to really empathize and to think about how someone else is feeling? But we often find ourselves sort of stuck in conversations about race. Like you might have somebody who has a different racial or ethnic background, and somehow you can talk about everything else but race, right? I mean, I think that and it's important for us too, to as we're thinking about awareness, to sort of bring these conversations to the fore. Like, don't wait for like an incident or an offense or an issue to arise before we have these great conversations about like what it means to be different. And it's a beautiful thing to be different and have access to different wells of culture and history. But it is also difficult, right? It's like that's sort of this enterprise of being in the US, is trying to navigate that difficulty. And so yeah, I absolutely think that like where awareness and consciousness, there's never too much of that, because there's a lot that we're just, you can't take it all in, right? Our brains are made to like minimize the things that aren't, absolutely sort of vital for us. And so we have to be, I think, intentional if we want to make a difference.
Absolutely. And Kim, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, to speak to Natalie's point about awareness, and your point as well, I found myself, interestingly, my daughter is now dating an African-American man. And we were sitting around the table the other day in our little pod, because he comes and visits and we do all our distancing and whatnot. But I found myself talking about my genealogic background, because I went through and had my DNA analyzed and whatnot to find out my background and whatnot. And I suddenly realized, oh, wait a minute, this may not be the best conversation to be having with Jake here, because he has no knowledge of his ancestry, where his people were from, because his ancestors were all slaves. So just having that sudden awareness of even something as seemingly simple as that shows that there's a bias there, and that there needs to be more education and awareness and openness about this.
So I just thought, Natalie, what you said about not being afraid of addressing these things, I think most of us are very uncomfortable, and we need to understand, first of all, not understand, but when is it safe? Are we going to be, not everyone that we speak to is going to be as open about discussing race. And so, on one hand, we do want to feel as if we can discuss it, but on the other hand, we don't want to offend anyone. So it's like it's a little quandary, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, like, absolutely, to, both your point and Kim's point, I really appreciate you sharing that, because the last thing that we need is more silence, right? So I think any sort of like maybe we don't have the language yet. And why don't we have the language? Because we haven't been talking about these things. Of course, we don't have the language yet. I think so. This idea of, being acknowledging that, and acknowledging that that's part of the difficulty, is that this is not something that we're taught. We're taught to not discuss it, to ignore it, we're taught that the polite thing is not to talk about it, right? And then we're sort of all, behind closed doors talking about it, right? So I think that that's, a huge problem that we think about, like, how do we move forward and not silence ourselves, or silence the opportunity for more connection, right? The opportunity for recognition of empathy, right? Recognition of that thoughtfulness.
Right. Betty, you have your real hand up then?
Yeah. So I had a comment regarding what Kim said. This was years ago when Jay Leno was still on the Tonight Show. And I don't remember who the actor was, but he was, his guest was some Black actor. And he had an unusual last name. And he started asking him about, where his ancestors were from. And I was embarrassed for him. I worked with a Black man, and he told me, everybody's last name, it was one time the slave owner. So this actor, his last name was, who knows where the original slave owner was from, but it didn't represent his background. And he was kind of, struggling to answer the question, and then they moved on to something else. But I was embarrassed for Jay Leno that he didn't know that, or, understand that if your last name is, some more common Anglo name, it doesn't really represent their heritage. So that was my first comment. And then my second comment was something, Natalie, that you were saying, if you are in a group of people that, have a different background, will it be taken positively if you say, oh, well, do you mind if I ask you about this? Or do you mind if we talk about this? Because sometimes I think people are afraid to bring something up, but they really do want to talk about it.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think two things. One, I think you can always ask a question. I think you can always ask a question. I think that if we can't ask a question, then we're already in trouble, right? You can always ask a question, and sometimes people feel offended by questions, and that's okay. Like, you still, I think, have, because you won't know, right? You won't know if you don't ask. I think the other thing is thinking about, like, how do we find out things we don't know? Obviously, the internet has a wealth of knowledge about some of the basic information, you know? So I think like saying instead of sometimes what happens is, say you're the only, you know, Black person in a group of people, then you kind of bear the burden of being like the racial, like, you know, translator. Like you're the one who says, well, how do Black people think about that? And now you have to represent all of, you know, all of Black people to this group of people, you know? And so I think that that can be uncomfortable, you know, that can absolutely be uncomfortable, and it can be wearing. I'm sure that you know, there are folks, you know, here who have similar situation, being the only woman in a group of men, being the only, you know, so it's often difficult, especially if there's like that power, historically at least, that power differential there. So I think that it is important to ask though, because I do think that especially if you're close to somebody or you consider yourselves friends, there might be a lot of things that you just haven't talked about that like that is bothering them, that is hurting them, that is, you know, that they're sort of shouldering without being given space in your, you know, friendship or relationship to share. And so I think that's really important too, because for me, what I think makes this so important, and James Baldwin is a great, you know, thinker about these ideas too. Like, to me, it goes back to like the humanity, you know, and the love. Bell Hooks is another great, you know, scholar about this. So if you're interested in reading like some of the ideas, James Baldwin for sure, Bell Hooks for sure, because in the end, it really is about like using words like love to talk about race. Right? Thinking about love and empathy and connection in these like sort of more heartsy words or these more emotional words that we don't always connect. You know, we think about you're either right about race or wrong about race, and that's not, it's too simple, right? And I think that that's really getting people in the tangle that you're talking about. Like, well, I don't know if I should ask, so maybe I don't ask because I don't want to offend someone, which is a right thought. Like the thought to not want to hurt somebody or offend somebody, right? I think it's the right impulse, but I think these right impulses are still keeping us from each other. They're keeping us from having these conversations, and we have to find a way to have conversations. Like I think that now more than ever, like our nation is just, you turn on any channel, we're just really having a terrible time figuring out how to have conversations with people who are not like us. And I think we have to figure it out, you know. And I think that we have lots of opportunity, but sometimes we're not really we're not really brave enough. At the end of the day, I do think it does have to do with bravery, being brave. I mean, you know, if my heart's in the right place, and I'm gonna ask, because if I don't ask, I won't know, you know.
What was the event that you were talking about for April 20th?
It's called the Innovative Arts Futures Conference. And so one of the things we're doing is, and we're just starting to plan and program, but every conference will have like a poet, you know, a poetry reading. We'll have some discussion about issues around Black identity, wellness. We're looking at sort of yoga and wellness, and the way that things like yoga, wellness, and veganism are also like racialized categories. So when you think about like, what does a vegan look like? You don't think about like some big, strong, like athletic Black man. Like, and so like, even as we think about things that should be racially neutral, right, these categories actually do have racial identities attached to them. And often they lead to like health disparities, because even for Black folks, they like, oh, that's not Black food, that's white food. Right. And so this idea of like what's healthy and what's good and what's, you know, a lot of times has this historical underpinning. So we will have different conversations and panels about a range of topics. That's just an example of one. So that's, yeah, April 20th, Innovative Art Futures Conference. And once we get a flyer, I'll email it to you, Janice, so you can, you know, share with folks if people want to attend.
I like the idea of the book chats, because then you're focusing on a subject.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a nice way to share a conversation that's more guided. Yeah. Do you get, what kind of have you done that much, and what kind of attendance do you get?
Yeah, we've been doing it since September. We've been doing it since August. And the attendance has ranged. I would say the average attendance has been about 20 folks every time. And we have, some people come every time. And then once a semester, we invite the author of the book to come to our book chat and be, have a little Q&A and be part of the discussion. So December, we had Dr. Bettina Love, who does work on teacher education. And she has a book called We Want to Do More Than Survive. And we had over 100 attendees for that event. So it just really, it depends on the draw of the author. But typically we have around about 20. And it's been a really great conversation. Like you said, like I love hearing people's stories about how these things sort of relate to them, parts of the books that we love. We don't always do, we often do books of poetry or books of fiction as well. So we'll be, reading some fiction and poetry as well as part of the book chat. So it's not just like books that you might consider like anti-racist training, right? It's sort of like also a range of like different authors that we like to be part of it. Like we read The Bluest Eye last semester, and it was a great conversation around like Toni Morrison and thinking about identity and like the creative element as part of it. So.
Okay.
Excellent.
So I know you talk to a lot of people around campus and in the community. Do you see a very difference in generations in terms of dealing with racism?
That's a really good question. I think that it's really interesting because I think a lot of like, because I'm thinking about also my personal like experience in talking to folks, because I feel like people who are sort of the generation before me, like my parents' generation, they're like appalled by so many things because they're old enough to remember civil rights movement. So they're like, what? This is like a rerun. Like we already did this. Like, why are we here again? And so I think that like in some ways that recognition of what things mean and sort of and really the grief of seeing, the nation that you love, the nation that you've believed in, sort of not espousing or holding to the ideals that that you believe in, I think is more difficult for folks that generate of the older generation for me. I think that the younger generation is, and this is just anecdotal, like this, I had to do the research and really find out, but I do feel like the younger generation is struggling more from like a cynicism, and sort of a not being able to know how to engage in impact, right? You have a generation who absolutely wants to do things. You see people marching in the streets and doing and these movements, but then when it comes down to like the daily practice, like what is the daily practice of these things? Like how can it translate and how do you sort of make a life out of it? I think that's a little harder for folks to translate. So you can be doing these things on one hand, but then on the other hand, still really struggling with things like bias and still really struggling with, there was that viral incident where the woman in Central Park, threatened the dog, the bird watcher, the gentleman who was a bird watcher, like that she was going to call the police and they were going to, as like a threat. But, all of this information came out, she was, voted for Obama, she was a liberal, she was all of these things that you associate with like racial progress and progressive, but they're not connected, right? So finding a way, again, to connect, because so many folks are isolated. We're incredibly more isolated, I think, racially. We don't have these conversations together anymore where like, I think about my parents' generation, you had segregation, but then you also had like spaces of conversation and that weren't as isolated. It's a strange moment where we have like so much of culture and media is so incredibly narrow and isolated, where even 20 years ago, like everybody watched the Cosby Show. Everybody, it's like you had these moments where pop culture, when it came, everybody came to these, for better or worse, like they came to these moments of intersection. Well, now you can only read about, learn about, hear about, be entertained by, folks who you absolutely, you self-selected. And there's also algorithms that self-select for you. So I think that part of it does have to do with like this digital age that's narrowing even the things that we see. Like we don't even see people who don't look like us and think like us. So we don't have this opportunity to imagine, and sort of practice in the entertainment that we have. And I think that's a huge part of it too.
That's a very amazing and scary thought. So there is another hand.
Yeah.
Let me see. It's Lorraine again. Yes.
Yes, I mean, I'm great that this is happening at the university level. I think, from what I understand, Orange County schools really don't have much in terms of education, with regard to history, racism in our county, and because it's not even required because we're 3%, the population is Black. So, does anybody know what's happening in terms of the elementary, high school education to get that changed? That's on the radar.
Well, I don't have a clue. Perhaps Natalie, you have some clue.
I don't know if they're like, what initiatives are there, right? I definitely have seen and heard the same issue, but I don't know if there are any sort of initiatives to, address, because so much of it comes from like the teachers, and as you know, teacher education is mostly white women, not even in Orange County. So that's like across the board, most K-5 teachers, are, so it's like are white women. So creating, the urgency, is I think it's more difficult, because it's like, somebody said earlier, awareness, like if you're not sort of aware, if you're not touched by it, sometimes you don't even know it's there.
It's kind of a patchwork system too, different school districts. Right. So I guess have to work maybe at the state level in terms of getting it on a curriculum. I'll think about it.
Parents and school boards have a ton, to do with this too. Like I know that recently there was across a lot of K-12, there was Black Lives Matter like weeks. So a lot of schools were, saying, okay, we're going to have a Black Lives Matter week. We're going to talk about it. We're going to figure out what it is. And I remember distinctly that, I think it was either Buena Park District or Anaheim District rejected, having that because they felt that like Black Lives Matter was a political phrase. But even the idea of saying like, well, we can say Black lives, we can say Black people, but we can't say Black Lives Matter because that might offend folks. So even the idea of what is political and what is not, and like being afraid of sort of politics, being afraid of, someone mentioned offending somebody, being afraid of offending people has now sort of gone in all directions. So it really is stifling, conversation and progress. And so I think also speaking to principals, I think on a small level, like speaking to principals, talking to parents, those sorts of things, I do think really do affect change because we're so close. One of the things that Bettina Love talked about in her discussion was that even if schools don't have Black teachers, even if they don't have very many Black students, right? I live in Buena Park. I would say out of all the options K-5, there was not more than like, and Buena Park is not your Belinda, right? So like even in Buena Park, there might be one other Black student in a classroom. And so like, but those schools can connect to African American studies programs, right? And so that was one of the things that Dr. Love suggested thinking about as a way forward, is thinking about how can we make use of the knowledge and the skills that already exist. How can we like say, okay, if you have a district that's struggling with this, well, why don't we think about broadening the, Cal State Fullerton's Black History Month celebration and inviting high schools to participate and saying, well, we know this is an issue in Fullerton, so let's like try to get, every high school to know about the program and maybe have one student speaker, and it's sort of just the idea of the conversation and the investment. I think would be a huge, leap forward. But it's again, like having people who care about, figuring it out, I think is a major issue. One of the things that we want to do with the Institute is start to build like a think tank of folks who are interested in like doing the work on a real like community, city by city level. Like how can we say, like how can we make Fullerton like the best city in relationship to racial progress? Like that's something I feel we could do. We have the university here. We have folks who are interested in progress. We can like look at some of the markers of inequity or issues, or, and address them, individually. And so I think that's like, one of the things we can think about as part of that think tank.
So are there any other questions or comments for Dr. Graham at this time? If not, I know she's very, very busy. We're going to let her go and on with the rest of her day. And thank you again, Natalie. We're so privileged to have you here and leading this wonderful new organization on campus. And thank you for participating with OLLI. And if you can think of ways that we can become more involved, you have a whole bunch of seniors with time to possibly be involved with the organization or with students or whatever you think might be appropriate.
That would be great. Yeah. And likewise, if you think of things, if OLLI, if you're interested in reaching out or someone thinks of a project or a program, we would love to try to partner and participate. It's definitely an ongoing conversation. And, I really appreciate you inviting me to be part of it.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to present for us.
Of course.
So at this point, I think we're going to end, and hopefully we'll see you again, Natalie.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
thank you again.
Okay,
Thank you, Natalie.
You're welcome. Thank you.